What's up YouTube, Josh of All Trades here, and today I'm talking about Westworld Episode 5, Contrapasso. This episode was really meaty in terms of ideology because we start seeing how the different characters think, and although there's different people on these different storylines that may never actually meet up with each other physically, I felt like this was the definitive episode where we can start putting people into camps. Like, hey, these characters think and behave this way, and this set of characters think and behave another way. Being that I think this episode was all about the ideas, that's probably the best way for me to group my thoughts in terms of the review and the action in this episode, so I'm getting into it. Right off the bat, the title intrigued me, Contrapasso. It's the idea coming from Latin words to suffer the opposite, and in Dante's Inferno, characters there suffered the opposite of their sins. For instance, if I was a glutton, maybe my punishment in hell would be to starve forever. And there's certainly a few different ways that we could apply this with the show. The foremost being that Westworld itself is hell for the hosts. That the hosts, for the most part, are just like perfectly normal, reasonable, average people just doing their own day-to-day activities. But this world is hell, and they're being punished, and they're beaten up, and killed, and shot up, and all the bad stuff that's happening to them, and it's the opposite of what they deserve. Another very concrete example that we saw of Contrapasso tonight was Logan there with William. Logan's been leading his life inside the park with the idea that what he does is all part of the game, and it doesn't matter because there's no consequences. Now, Logan's obviously suffering the opposite when we see him like getting grabbed and beat up by the characters, and William takes note of it and just walks away. But I also think this is very significant because we kind of got more exposition on the William-Logan story, and it seems like William is Logan's brother-in-law, but he's also his subordinate at some point or some level in this company. So they have this thick dynamic of relations between them. And Logan's been acting like what he does in the park has no consequences because it's all a game, but it's very obvious at this point that there's an ideological difference between William and Logan, and whatever tension they have inside the park is probably going to extend to their relationship and relationships outside of Westworld. This episode was also very interesting in its use of memento mori, or a image reminding one of their own mortality. There's a really neat scene where Dolores is standing in a field of crosses, and where the average person would be thinking about a graveyard and all these deaths and about how we're going to die someday, Dolores is standing there thinking about her own memories and how she's died multiple times in the past, but yet she isn't one of these crosses. The second use of memento mori I saw in the Dolores story is towards the end when they're in the house of ill repute. She goes to see a fortune teller in a room, and she's there with the tarot cards and the skulls and crossbones on the wall. And depending on the character that you're thinking about, I think the meaning kind of diverges here. As far as Dolores and the characters like her, Dolores has died many times before, and she typically forgets the past. And at this point, we're probably thinking about the implications for Dolores, like what happens if she dies right now. Because of this uncertainty, there's probably an amount of fear that Dolores is experiencing, that she doesn't know what's going to happen and what she's going to remember the next time she dies. For other characters like Maeve, this may actually be an empowering feeling though. It was a really interesting twist when we saw Maeve sitting up again inside the laboratory and catching the bird on her finger, and she's acting very purposefully at this point. Maeve understands that if she dies, she'll just be brought back again, so there's really no trepidation on her part, and we see her just making forward progress because of this. The third big idea that I caught in this episode is the idea of loops and the cyclical nature of life. Probably my favorite use of this was in the Lawrence story. We saw him get hung upside down and strung up and cut up and killed by the man in black. But lo and behold, Lawrence was back almost immediately again in his role as Alfonso, or this outlaw criminal character. The idea of loops was heavily explored in the scene between Dr. Ford and Dolores, and I think it's important to note that Dolores was unclothed in this scene, as in contrast to the scenes when she's being talked to by Bernard. And Dr. Ford asks Dolores if she's content or if she wants to break out of her loop, and he actually says that it's something that Arnold wanted to do. So I'm wondering if this isn't just a threat to Dolores, asking that if she wants to get out of line, he'll turn her off or kill her. But also I feel like the idea of loops is relevant inside and outside of Westworld. We know that there's some characters like Teddy that keep saying that someday he'll come back for Dolores and they'll get out of there. And in our lives, we do things in loops. Like I go to work regularly and I basically do a very specialized task over and over again. Every week I watch Westworld and I make reviews, and every day I brush my teeth, and the entirety of life is loops. And when we have fantasies about getting out of our lives and doing something else, we don't think about like picking up and moving and becoming an accountant somewhere else where we do the same thing over and over again. Like we imagine some sort of scenario where we get to express ourselves and our creativity and our passions and whatever we want to do on whatever basis we want to do it. And I think this episode of Westworld is giving us a thinking exercise to try to imagine ourselves in a reality where there are no loops. And it's very unlikely that they just don't exist at all. Even in an idealized version of reality, we'll probably settle into some sort of schedule and some sort of routine. So I think the show's really asking us, are loops such a bad thing, or is it a natural part of life? Finally, there was a very important scene between Dr. Ford and the Man in Black. In this scene, again, the Man in Black is asserting that there's some sort of truth and narrative, and there's something to find at the end of this park. And Dr. Ford, going along with what he said before, is insisting that there's no narrative, but your actions in Westworld are just a journey of self-discovery. This is echoing William's sentiment at the beginning of the episode when he's talking with Logan, saying that Logan's actions say something more about him than they do about the park. But interestingly enough, the Man in Black does know about Arnold, and he persists that there is something to learn. And so going forward, I think that's one of my biggest questions. Does the Man in Black have a point, or is he like these Confederados that are chasing after an idea that's been lost with time and that they're never going to actually recover? I like to think that Westworld is an exercise in self-discovery, like Dr. Ford said, but if there wasn't a moral at the end, or even an end, why would there be a maze? And the other big story this episode brought up that didn't touch on too much was the robot that smashed himself had some sort of transmitter in his arm that someone was using to smuggle data outside of Westworld. This is going to leave me wondering who's smuggling data outside of Westworld and why are they doing it? I know it's still a little early to start making assumptions, but right off the top of my head, I'm thinking that Logan's family has a big stake in Westworld, and the financial success of this park is questionable, so maybe they're trying to learn as much as they can about the park before exiting or starting their own venture. Either way, Westworld Episode 5 was a huge thinker episode. I think it left us with a lot to simmer on, a lot to wonder about going forward, and I'm really enjoying this series. I'm interested to see where it's going, and I'm still intrigued. So good job to the creators there. I'm definitely going to be watching as usual. Tell me what you thought about the episode in the comments below. Go ahead, hit that like button. Subscribe to Joshua Trades if you haven't yet. And I will see y'all next time. Bye, y'all.